trumpets had barely finished sounding when the whole hall went silent, and every silence in a room full of wolves means something is about to break. Chaol Ashgrave stood at the top of the stone steps, his crown still warm from the moment the elders had placed it on his head, and he felt the bond snap into place inside his chest, like a rope pulled tight after years of slack. It did not ask permission, it simply arrived, sudden and certain, pulling his gaze across the crowded hall to a woman standing near the far wall in a blue gown, her dark hair pinned high, her hands folded in front of her, as though she already knew what was coming. Her name was Leora Vantry, daughter of one of the oldest families in the kingdom, and for one full breath, Chaol let himself believe that this day, of all days, would be the one where everything finally went right. He walked toward her. The crowd parted the way crowds do for kings, though a few hours earlier he had only been a prince, and even that had never felt entirely secure. He had spent his whole life being measured against his father, against his uncles, against every broad-shouldered alpha who had ever worn the Ashgrave name, and he had always come up shorter, leaner, quieter. But none of that had mattered in the moment the bond ignited, because bonds did not care about shoulders or height. They cared about something older than muscle, something that lived underneath the skin. He reached her. He said her name softly, the way he had imagined saying it for years without knowing whose name it would be. She looked up at him, and for one terrible second he watched her face move through surprise, then confusion, then something colder. She stepped back. The hall noticed. Of course the hall noticed. 300 nobles, warriors, and elders were watching their new king reach for his fated mate, and every one of them saw her retreat from his outstretched hand, as if it belonged to a stranger she did not trust. "I am sorry," Leora said, loud enough that the words traveled further than she probably intended. "I cannot do this." Chaol kept his hand where it was, foolishly, as though if he held still long enough, she might change her mind. "Look at you," she said, and her voice cracked, not with sadness, but with something closer to embarrassment. "I was raised to stand beside a king who could hold a kingdom together with his bare hands. I was raised to expect a mate who filled a room the moment he walked into it. You are—" She stopped herself, but the hall filled in the rest of the sentence anyway, because everyone in it had thought the same unkind thought at some point about their new, slender, quiet king. "You are not what I was promised," she finished, and then she did the one thing that no Omega or Alpha in that hall had ever seen done in public, not at a coronation, not ever. She turned her wrist outward, showing the mark that had begun to form there, the mark that belonged to him and no one else, and she rejected it, not privately, not gently, but standing in front of the entire kingdom, so that every person present would remember exactly what she thought of their king. The bond did not simply fade, it tore. Chaol felt it the way he imagined a man might feel a blade pulled slowly out of his own chest, a pain that did not announce itself all at once but arrived in long, dragging waves. He kept his face still. He had learned, over many years of being the smaller prince in a family of giants, exactly how to keep his face still, while something inside him came apart. "Then it is done," he said, and his voice did not shake, though everything else in him did. He turned and walked back up the steps to the throne, because a king who had just been crowned could not be seen running from his own hall, no matter how badly he wanted to. He sat down. He placed his hands on the arms of the throne. He looked out at 300 faces that had just watched him get rejected in front of the entire kingdom, and he made himself breathe, slowly, until the room understood that the coronation was continuing, whether anyone liked it or not. Leora did not stay to watch the rest of the ceremony. She left through a side door, her blue gown disappearing into the corridor, and the whispers that followed her out were nothing compared to the ones that stayed behind in the hall, circling Chaol like smoke that would not clear. By the time the sun set that day, every household in the capital had heard some version of the story. By the time the sun set the following week, every household in the kingdom had heard it. The details shifted depending on who told it. In some versions, Leora had wept. In some versions, Chaol had begged. But the core of the story never changed, because it did not need embellishment to be devastating. The new king of Ashgrave had been rejected by his own fated mate, in front of his entire court, on the very day he was crowned, because she thought him too small to be worthy of her. Chaol did not speak of it, not to his advisors, not to the guards who had stood witness, not even to the old wolf who had raised him after his father died. A gruff, gray-muzzled man named Owen Brant, who had served 3 generations of Ashgrave kings and had never once seen one of them flinch, until now. Owen found him 3 days later in the Eastern Tower, standing at the window that looked out over the training yards, watching a group of young soldiers spar in the cold morning air. Owen did not ask how he was. He had learned long ago that some wolves answered that question honestly, and some did not, and Cale had never been the honest kind, not about pain. "They are saying you will not hold the throne past a year," Owen said instead, because that, at least, Cale would respond to. "Let them say it." Cale did not turn from the window. "You should say something. To the court. To settle the talk before it grows roots." There is nothing to say that will not sound like an excuse. Cale watched one of the young soldiers below get knocked flat onto his back by a much larger opponent, only to spring back up a moment later, faster than the boy who had struck him. "Do you know what I have decided, Owen?" "Tell me." "I have decided that I do not need a mate to hold a kingdom together. My father believed the two things were tied to each other, that a king was only as strong as the bond at his side, but I do not believe that anymore. I will rule with my mind. I will rule with the loyalty I earn from the people who choose to follow me, not the loyalty owed to me by fate. That will be enough." Owen studied him for a long moment, the kind of long moment that only came from a man who had known someone since before that someone could walk. "That is a hard way to live, boy." "It is the only way left to me," Cale said, and that was the end of the conversation. He kept his word. In the years that followed, he did not seek out another bond, though there were whispers, always whispers, that another Omega might carry his mark, if he simply tried, if he simply let himself hope again. He refused every suggestion. He built walls instead, not walls of stone but walls made of policy and discipline and an unshakable determination to prove, one decision at a time, that Leora Vantry had been wrong about him. He worked harder than any king before him. He rode to the northern border himself to settle a dispute between 2 feuding packs, rather than sending an envoy. He sat through council meetings that ran past midnight, memorizing every treaty, every grain shipment, every soldier's name in the Royal Guard, because if he could not be the largest alpha in the room, he would be the most prepared one. Slowly, the whispers about his size began to compete with new whispers, about how the young king never missed a detail, never forgot a promise, never let a threat against his kingdom go unanswered. But at night, alone in the rooms that had once belonged to his father, he still felt the place where the bond had torn. It had scarred over, the way wounds do, but scars ache sometimes, in cold weather, in quiet moments, in the space between waking and sleeping, when a man's guard is lowest. He told himself it did not matter. He told himself a great many things, in those years, and believed most of them during the day, and none of them at night. 5 years passed this way. The kingdom grew steadier under his rule, even as the ache in him did not. He built a reputation as a fair and relentless king, one who listened to farmers as carefully as he listened to generals, one who remembered the names of servants' children. He was respected, he was, in his own quiet way, admired. But he was also alone, and everyone around him could see it, even if no one dared say it to his face. There were moments, during those 5 years, when the kingdom tried gently to nudge him back toward hope. In the second year, a delegation of elders suggested he consider a second bonding ceremony, arguing that a king without a mate was a king without an heir, and a king without an heir was a kingdom waiting for trouble. Cale listened to the entire proposal, without interrupting, then thanked them for their concern, and refused, politely but completely, in a way that made it clear the conversation would not be repeated. In the third year, a visiting lord attempted to introduce his unmated daughter at a banquet, seating her beside Cale, with obvious intention, and Cale spent the evening speaking to her about grain tariffs and border patrols, with such relentless focus on policy, that she left the table more confused than charmed. Word of these small refusals spread through the court, the way all things spread through a court, quietly at first, and then everywhere at once, until the nobles stopped trying, and simply accepted that their king had closed a door inside himself, and did not intend to open it again. Owen watched this happen, with the particular helplessness of a man who loved someone he could not fix. He had raised Cale from a boy who flinched at his own father's booming laugh, into a king who no longer flinched at anything, and there were nights Owen wondered whether that transformation was a triumph or a quiet tragedy, and whether it was possible for it to be both at once. He did not push. He had tried pushing, in the early days, and had learned quickly that pushing only made Cale retreat further behind the calm, capable mask he wore for the rest of the world. So Owen waited instead, the way old wolves learn to wait, trusting that time changes even the most stubborn hearts, though he privately worried that Cale's heart had grown too well armored for time to reach it at all. The kingdom itself prospered under Cale's relentless attention, even if its king did not. He renegotiated trade agreements with the coastal territories that had gone unchanged for 2 generations, correcting imbalances that had quietly drained the treasury for years. He reorganized the royal guard after uncovering corruption among several senior officers, replacing them with younger soldiers chosen for competence rather than family name, a decision that earned him enemies among the old guard and fierce loyalty among the new. He personally reviewed every grievance brought to the capital courts during his first 2 years on the throne, a task most kings delegated entirely, because he wanted the people to know that their king was paying attention, that no complaint would vanish into the machinery of a bureaucracy that did not care. Slowly, almost without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened, the story people told about Cale Ashgrave began to shift. It was still true that he had been rejected at his coronation. That fact could never be erased from the kingdom's memory, but it stopped being the only fact people reached for when his name came up. Farmers spoke of the winter. He had personally ordered emergency grain reserves opened 3 weeks, before anyone else had recognized the coming shortage. Soldiers spoke of a king who trained beside them in the yard, rather than watching from a balcony, who had taken more than one hard fall in the sparring ring, and never once complained about the bruises. Merchants spoke of fair tariffs and honest weights. The whispers about his size did not vanish entirely. Whispers rarely do, but they grew quieter, crowded out by louder, more recent stories about a king who worked harder than anyone had expected him to. And yet none of it touched the place inside him that still ached on cold nights. Achievement, Cale had learned, could fill a great many hours of the day, but it could not fill the particular silence of an empty chamber at midnight, and no amount of successful treaties had ever managed to convince the scarred place near his heart that it was not, in fact, still bleeding somewhere underneath the scar. It was in the 5th year, during the hardest winter the kingdom had seen in a generation, that everything began to change, though Cale would not understand that for weeks. A drought in the southern territories had failed 2 harvests in a row, and word came that refugees were streaming north across the border, entire packs displaced from lands that could no longer feed them. Cale rode out himself to inspect the camps that had sprung up along the river, camps of exhausted, hungry wolves, who had walked for weeks to reach Ashgrave soil. He went without a large guard, against Owen's advice, because he wanted to see the conditions with his own eyes, rather than through a report written by someone comfortable in the capital. The camp stretched along the riverbank for nearly a mile, tents and lean-tos and fires burning low against the cold. Children ran between the shelters despite the chill, and older wolves sat wrapped in whatever blankets they had managed to carry from home. Cale walked among them without announcing his rank, listening to complaints about the cold, about the lack of fresh water, about a group of soldiers assigned to the camp who had grown careless and cruel with their authority over people who had no power to complain. It was near the edge of the camp, close to where the tree line began, that he first heard the raised voice. A large alpha, one of the soldiers assigned to guard duty, had cornered a smaller figure against a supply cart, his voice loud with the kind of confidence that came from knowing no one nearby would challenge him. Cale could not make out the words from a distance, only the tone, sharp and threatening, the tone of someone used to being obeyed simply because of his size. The smaller figure did not back away. Cale moved closer, expecting to intervene, expecting to find someone frightened and small easy prey for a soldier who had forgotten his duty was to protect the camp, not terrorize it. Instead, as he came within earshot, he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. "You can stand there and raise your voice as long as you like," the smaller figure said, and it was a woman's voice, steady and unbothered. "But it will not change the fact that these people were promised clean water 3 days ago and have not received it. Shouting at me does not fill a single bucket." The soldier took a step closer, using his height the way large alphas often did, letting the shadow of himself fall over her, a wordless threat that had worked on countless smaller wolves before. She did not flinch, she did not step back. She simply crossed her arms and waited, as though his looming presence were nothing more than weather she intended to wait out. "I could report you to the captain," the soldier said. "Please do," she answered. "Tell him exactly what you told me. Tell him you have been diverting the water rations to your own tent while children in this camp go thirsty. I am sure he will find that very interesting." The soldier's face changed, the confidence draining out of it fast, replaced by something closer to panic. He glanced around, perhaps for the first time noticing how many people nearby had gone quiet to listen, and then he turned and walked away without another word, his shoulders stiff with the particular fury of a man who has just lost an argument he expected to win easily. The woman watched him go, then turned back to the cart she had been standing beside, and continued sorting through it, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Cale stood a short distance away, unnoticed, and found himself unable to look away from her. She was not tall. She had a slight limp that showed itself when she shifted her weight from the cart, favoring one leg in a way that suggested an old injury rather than a fresh one. Her clothes were plain and worn from travel, the kind of clothes that marked her as one of the refugees rather than a soldier or an official. And yet she had just stood her ground against an alpha nearly twice her size, without raising her voice, without so much as a flicker of fear crossing her face, armed with nothing but the truth and the willingness to say it out loud. Cale had spent 5 years being told, in 100 quiet and unquiet ways, that size determined worth, that the shape of a body decided how much respect it deserved. He had spent 5 years trying to prove otherwise, through policy and discipline and endless work. And here, in a refugee camp on the coldest winter in a generation, was a woman who seemed to have never believed the lie in the first place. He did not approach her that day. He told himself it was because there was still the rest of the camp to inspect, still soldiers to reprimand, still water rations to correct before nightfall. All of that was true. But some smaller, more honest part of him knew that he had not approached her, because he was not yet ready to test whether she would look at him the way Leora once had, and he did not think he could survive that particular disappointment twice. He rode back to the capital that evening, with the image of her steady, unafraid face fixed in his mind, though he did not yet know her name. It would be Owen, 3 days later, who brought him the report on conditions in the camp, a report that included, almost as an afterthought, a note about a sharp-tongued refugee who had caught the attention of the camp administrators for her skill with numbers and her fearless handling of unruly soldiers. Her name, the report said, was Sora Linden, and the administrators were recommending she be brought into the capital to help manage the growing refugee accounts, since her memory for detail and her stubborn insistence on fairness had already prevented several supply shortages from turning into disasters. Cale read the name 3 times before he set the report down. He told himself it meant nothing, that the kingdom needed capable people wherever it could find them, and that approving her transfer to the capital archives was simply good governance. He told himself this while signing the order with a steadier hand than the situation seemed to require, and he told himself this again that night, lying awake in the dark, listening to the wind move through the tower windows, wondering what it might be like to hear that steady, unafraid voice up close. He did not know yet that the woman from the riverbank would change everything he believed about himself. He only knew that for the first time in 5 years, he found himself looking forward to something, and that alone was enough to keep him awake long into the night, turning her name over in his mind like a stone he could not put down. Sora Linden arrived at the capital on a gray morning in early spring, riding in the back of a supply wagon with nothing more than a small satchel and a stubborn refusal to look impressed by the towering gates of Ashgrave Castle. She had heard stories about the capital her entire life, stories that made it sound like a place built by giants for giants, and she had expected to feel small walking through its streets. Instead, she felt mostly tired, and a little annoyed that the wagon driver had taken the long route through the market square, rather than the direct road to the archive quarter. The castle archivist, an anxious, ink-stained wolf named Nolan Price, met her at the servants' entrance with a stack of ledgers already balanced precariously in his arms. He introduced himself in a rush of words, explained that the refugee accounts had fallen badly behind, and led her through a maze of corridors to a low-ceilinged room, stacked floor to ceiling, with records that had clearly not been organized by anyone with patience or system in mind. "This is everything from the southern camps," Nolan said, setting the ledgers down on a long wooden table with visible relief, as though he had been waiting weeks for someone else to take responsibility for them. "Grain distribution, water allocation, housing assignments. It is, I will admit, something of a mess. Sora looked at the room, at the crooked stacks and the dust thick enough to write in, and felt something in her settle, rather than panic, the particular calm of a person who has always found comfort in solving problems other people found overwhelming. "Give me 2 weeks," she said, "and it will not be a mess anymore." It took her 9 days, not 2 weeks, and by the end of it, the ledgers were organized by camp, by month, and by category, cross-referenced in a system of her own devising that Nolan admitted, somewhat sheepishly, made more sense than anything the archive had used in the previous decade. Word of her efficiency reached the castle's senior stewards quickly, and within a month she had been given a permanent post overseeing the refugee accounts, a small room of her own near the main archive, and a stipend that was modest but, for the first time in her life, entirely hers. She did not know, in those first weeks, that the king had personally approved her transfer. She assumed, reasonably, that some administrator far removed from the throne had noticed her work at the camp and passed the recommendation up through the usual channels. She had no reason to think the king himself had read her name and felt something shift in his chest, because kings, in her experience, did not concern themselves with the movements of refugee clerks, and she had no interest in imagining otherwise. Cale found his first excuse to visit the archive quarter 2 weeks after her arrival, and told himself it had nothing to do with her at all. The excuse was reasonable enough on its surface. The southern refugee accounts needed royal review before the spring budget could be finalized, and it was not unusual for a king to inspect important records in person rather than waiting for a summary to be delivered. He told Owen this explanation with such careful precision that Owen, who had known him since boyhood, said nothing at all and simply raised one gray eyebrow in a way that made Cale feel thoroughly seen and thoroughly annoyed about it. He found her exactly where the report said she would be, bent over a ledger at the long wooden table, a candle burning low beside her despite the daylight filtering weakly through the narrow window. She did not look up immediately when he entered, too absorbed in whatever column of numbers held her attention, and Cale found himself grateful for the extra few seconds it gave him to simply look at her, without being observed in return. "You are blocking my light," she said finally, without lifting her head. Cale blinked, startled out of his own thoughts, and stepped to the side. "Better?" "Marginally." She glanced up then, and something in her expression shifted when she registered who was standing in front of her, though not in the way he had braced himself for. There was no flicker of disappointment, no quick assessment of his height or build. There was only mild curiosity, the look of someone deciding whether a visitor was worth the interruption to her work. "You are the king." "I am. You do not usually review ledgers in person. Nolan told me the last king to set foot in this room was your father, and that was to complain about the smell of old parchment. I am reviewing the southern accounts before the budget session," Cale said, which was true, though it did not explain why he had chosen to review them at the exact hour Nolan had mentioned, entirely by accident, that the new clerk usually worked alone. Sora studied him for a moment longer, then pushed the ledger a few inches in his direction, an invitation rather than a surrender. "Then you should see this. Whoever managed these accounts before I arrived was either careless or dishonest, and I have not yet decided which, though I suspect it does not much matter to the families who went without grain because of it." She walked him through the discrepancies with the same steady confidence she had shown the soldier at the camp, pointing out shipments recorded as delivered that had never reached their destination, allocations that had somehow shrunk between the Treasury's records and the camp's own tallies. She did not soften her observations to spare anyone's feelings, including his, and at one point stated plainly that the previous overseer of Southern accounts should be dismissed and possibly investigated, a level of directness few people in the castle dared use with their king. Cale found himself smiling, an expression that felt unfamiliar enough that he was aware of the muscles required to produce it. "You do not soften your opinions much." "Softening opinions wastes time," Sora said. "If the grain went missing, someone should say so plainly, so it can be fixed. I do not see the use in dressing up a problem in polite language just to spare the person who caused it. Most people at court disagree with you. Most people at court have not spent a winter watching children go hungry because the person responsible for feeding them was more interested in flattery than honesty." Her tone did not rise, did not sharpen into anger, but something steady and unshakable moved beneath it, the certainty of someone who had earned her convictions the hard way. "I am not interested in flattery, Your Majesty. If that is a problem, I am sure Nolan can find someone else to review the ledgers with you." "It is not a problem," Cale said, faster than he meant to, and then, because it felt important to be as honest as she had just been with him, he added, "It is, in fact, rather refreshing." Something in her expression eased slightly at that, not quite a smile, but the loosening of a posture that had been braced for a different reaction entirely. "Then we understand each other." He stayed longer than the ledgers required, asking questions about the camp conditions she had witnessed, about the system she had built to organize the accounts, about the injury that caused her limp, a question he immediately regretted asking, expecting her to close off the way most people did when a stranger pried into an old wound. She did not close off. "A wagon wheel, years ago. It healed wrong. It does not bother me most days, though it makes long walks tiresome, and gives soldiers something to underestimate me about, which occasionally works in my favor." She said this last part with the faintest trace of dry humor, and Cale found himself laughing, a short surprised sound that seemed to catch them both off guard. He left the archive an hour later with a folder of notes he barely remembered writing, and a strange, unfamiliar lightness in his chest that he could not immediately name, though he recognized, uneasily, that he had not felt it in 5 years. He told himself, walking back through the castle corridors, that it was simply the satisfaction of finding a competent administrator, nothing more complicated than that. He told himself this several more times over the following days. Each time he found a new reason to visit the archive quarter, each time a little less convincingly than the last. Owen noticed the pattern before Cale was willing to admit it existed. He noticed the way the king's schedule had begun to include unusually frequent visits to review urgent archive matters that never seemed quite urgent enough to require a steward instead of the king himself. He noticed too the change in Cale's mood on the days those visits occurred, a lightness that lingered for hours afterward, entirely unlike the controlled, careful demeanor Cale had worn for the past 5 years. "You have been to the archives 4 times this week," Owen observed one evening, as Cale reviewed reports by candlelight in his study. "The Southern accounts require careful attention," Cale said, not looking up. "The Southern accounts required careful attention a month ago. I believe they have since received quite a lot of it." Owen settled into the chair across from the desk, uninvited, the privilege of a man who had earned the right to sit wherever he pleased in Cale's presence. "Her name is Sora Linden. I looked into her file, since you seemed determined not to." Cale's pen paused briefly against the page before continuing. "I do not know what you mean." "I mean, boy, that I have not seen you smile this often since before your coronation, and I am old enough to recognize the reason, without needing you to say it aloud." Owen's voice softened, losing its usual gruffness. "I am not warning you against it. I am simply saying that I see it, and I am glad of it, whatever it turns out to be." Cale set the pen down at last, and looked at the old wolf who had raised him, who had watched him rebuild himself piece by careful piece after the worst day of his life, and found he did not have the energy to deny what both of them already knew. "I do not know what it is yet," he admitted quietly. "I am not certain I am ready to find out." "No one is ever certain," Owen said. "That has never once stopped it from happening anyway." What Owen did not know, and what Cale would not have guessed, was that Sora had noticed the pattern of his visits just as clearly as Owen had, though she drew a very different conclusion from it. She assumed, at first, that the king was simply a thorough administrator, the kind of ruler who liked to see his kingdom's problems solved with his own eyes, rather than trusting reports written by other hands. It was only after the 6th visit, when he arrived with a question about a shipment that any junior clerk could have answered, that she began to suspect something else entirely. She mentioned this, cautiously, to the one friend she had made in the capital, a quick-witted seamstress named Ivy Calder, who worked in the castle's laundry rooms and had a gift for noticing things others missed. Ivy had grown up in the capital and knew the castle's rhythms the way some wolves knew the shape of their own paws, and she listened to Sora's description of the king's frequent, thinly justified visits with an expression of barely suppressed delight. "He is courting you," Ivy said, not as a question. "He is reviewing ledgers. He is reviewing the same 3 ledgers for the 4th time this month, according to what you just told me." That is not administration, Sora. That is a king who has run out of reasons to see you, and keeps inventing new ones anyway. Ivy folded a length of fabric with practiced efficiency, not looking up, as though the observation required no particular effort to make. Everyone in the castle has noticed. You would notice too, if you spent less time buried in numbers, and more time paying attention to the wolves around you. Sora considered this, turning it over the way she turned over a suspicious ledger entry, searching for the flaw in the logic. He was rejected. Everyone knows the story. Why would a king who was humiliated in front of his entire court risk that again, over an archive clerk with a bad leg, and no family name worth mentioning? Perhaps because the archive clerk with the bad leg does not care about family names, Ivy said, finally looking up, her expression gentler than her words had been a moment before. Perhaps that is exactly why he keeps finding excuses to sit across a table from her. Sora did not answer that directly, though the words stayed with her longer than she wanted to admit, returning to her in quiet moments over the following days, when she should have been focused entirely on the columns of numbers in front of her instead. She told herself she had no interest in complicating her life with the attention of a king, a man whose position alone would draw scrutiny to anyone standing near him, scrutiny she had spent her whole life avoiding by simply staying useful and unremarkable. She had built a stable, quiet existence in the capital, the first stable existence she had known since the drought had taken everything from her family years earlier, and she had no intention of risking it for anyone, king or otherwise. And yet, when Kale appeared in the archive doorway 2 days later, holding a report about grain reserves that clearly could have waited until the next council meeting, she found herself pulling out the chair across from her own without being asked, and found, too, that she did not particularly mind that he took it. The knife came out of the dark so fast that Sora barely had time to register the shape of it before Kale's arm swept across the table and knocked the ledgers, the candle, and nearly her own hand out of its path. It happened on a night that had begun ordinarily enough. Sora had stayed late in the archive, chasing a discrepancy that had bothered her for 3 days, a pattern of grain shipments recorded as sent to the southern camps that never appeared in the camp's own receiving logs. The gap was small at first glance, easy to dismiss as clerical error, but Sora had learned long ago that small gaps in careful records were rarely accidents. She had traced the pattern back 6 months, cross-referencing signatures and dates, when she finally noticed that every discrepant shipment bore the authorization mark of a single officer, a name she recognized from the castle guard rosters as belonging to a senior commander named Bram Ostley. She had been so absorbed in the discovery that she did not hear the archive door open behind her, did not notice the figure that slipped between the shelves, until a hand closed roughly over her mouth and a blade pressed cold against her throat. "You should have left the numbers alone," a low voice said against her ear, and Sora, frozen with the particular helpless fear of a body that has gone still without permission, felt the blade shift as the man behind her adjusted his grip. It was Kale's arrival, unannounced and entirely unexpected, that saved her. He had come to return a set of notes he had borrowed the day before, a flimsy excuse even by his recent standards, and he crossed the threshold of the archive in time to see a hooded figure with a knife at Sora's throat, and every rational thought left his mind at once. He did not think. He moved, closing the distance between the doorway and the table faster than his own body seemed capable of, and drove his shoulder into the attacker's side with enough force to break the man's grip on Sora, and send them both crashing into the shelf of ledgers behind them. Parchment scattered across the floor. Sora scrambled backward, breathing hard, one hand pressed to the shallow cut at her throat, where the blade had nicked her before Kale's strike knocked it away. The attacker recovered quickly, rolling to his feet with the trained economy of a soldier, and lunged again, this time toward Kale. The fight that followed was short and vicious, conducted almost entirely in silence, except for the grunt of impact and the scrape of overturned furniture, and it ended when Kale, smaller than his opponent but faster, ducked beneath a wild swing and drove his elbow into the man's throat, hard enough to send him sprawling, gasping, against the wall. By the time the castle guards arrived, alerted by the noise, the attacker lay unconscious on the archive floor, and Kale was kneeling beside Sora, his hands hovering uncertainly near her, as though he did not trust himself not to grip her too tightly and hurt her further. "I am fine," Sora said, though her voice shook slightly, betraying the fear she was working hard to keep out of it. "It is a shallow cut. I have had worse." "You are not fine," Cale said, his own hands trembling now that the immediate danger had passed, the adrenaline draining out of him and leaving something rawer behind. "Someone came into my castle and put a blade against your throat." "Our castle, apparently, has a security problem," Sora said, attempting dry humor even as her breath still came unevenly, and something about her stubborn refusal to fully surrender to fear made Cale's chest ache in a way he did not have time to examine. The captain of the guard, a steady, unflappable wolf named Dane Wren, arrived moments later and took charge of the scene with brisk efficiency, ordering the unconscious attacker bound and moved to the castle's holding cells for questioning, and posting extra guards at every archive entrance for the remainder of the night. It was Dane who first suggested, cautiously, that this had not been a random act of violence. "He was not here to steal," Dane said, examining the scattered ledgers, the specific shelf the attacker had clearly been heading for, before Sora's discovery interrupted his plans. "He came for something specific, or someone specific." Cale's jaw tightened. Find out who sent him. It took 3 days of careful questioning to get anything useful out of the attacker. A hired blade, with no particular loyalty to whoever had paid him, willing to trade information for leniency once it became clear that silence would earn him nothing but a longer sentence. What he eventually revealed sent a cold current through the small group gathered in Cale's private study to hear it. He had been paid, through an intermediary he never met directly, to retrieve or destroy a set of shipping records before they could reach the king's attention, and to eliminate anyone who had already seen them. "The Southern grain accounts," Sora said quietly, the pieces falling into place with the particular clarity of a puzzle finally resolving. "The discrepancies I found. Someone has been diverting shipments meant for the refugee camps, and profiting from selling them elsewhere, and they used Commander Ostley's authorization to cover the trail." Owen, seated near the fire with his arms crossed, said what everyone in the room was already thinking. If Bram Ostley is involved in stealing from starving refugees, he is either working alone for profit, which would be foolish given how easily the trail leads back to him, or he is working for someone with far more reach than a single corrupt commander. Someone with the resources to hire an assassin, and the reach to know exactly when a lowly archive clerk had uncovered the pattern, Cale said, his voice low and controlled in the way it became when he was working hard to keep something more dangerous contained beneath it. "Find Ostley, quietly. I want him watched before he is questioned, in case he leads us to whoever gave the order." Dane nodded, and left to arrange it, and the room emptied slowly afterward, each person carrying the weight of what had nearly happened, what might still be coming. Sora remained behind, still absorbing the reality that her careful accounting work had uncovered something far larger and far more dangerous than a simple clerical error, something that had nearly cost her life within hours of her discovering it. Cale stayed with her, unwilling to leave, though he told himself it was a matter of security rather than anything more personal. "You should not stay in the archive quarters tonight. I will have rooms prepared for you closer to the royal wing, where the guard presence is heaviest." "You do not need to move me across the castle over one attack," Sora said, though her voice lacked its usual certainty, the events of the evening having worn away some of her customary steadiness. "I am not asking," Cale said, gently, but without room for argument, "because the alternative is that I do not sleep at all tonight, wondering whether whoever sent that man will try again before dawn." Something in the way he said her name, quiet and unguarded, made her look up at him properly, past the crown and the title and the careful composure he wore in front of the rest of the court, to the man underneath, who had just fought off an assassin with his bare hands to protect a clerk he had known for barely a month. She saw, in that moment, something she had not let herself see clearly before, that his frequent visits to the archive had never truly been about ledgers at all, and that the fear, currently written plainly across his face, had nothing to do with the political danger of a corrupt commander, and everything to do with how close he had come to losing her, before he had even found the courage to tell her what she meant to him. "All right," she said softly, "move me." He walked her personally to the new rooms that night, staying in the corridor outside, until she had confirmed the door was securely locked, and it was only after he had returned to his own chamber, alone in the dark, that he allowed himself to acknowledge the full weight of what he had felt, watching that blade against her throat. It had not been the alarm of a king protecting a valuable administrator. It had been something far older and far more frightening, the particular terror of a man watching the person who had begun, without his permission, to matter more to him than anything else in his kingdom. He did not sleep that night. He sat by the window instead, watching the moon move slowly across the sky, turning over the same question again and again, without finding an answer he was ready to accept. What was he supposed to do now that he had discovered, in the space of a single violent evening, that he was no longer capable of imagining his life without her in it? The watch on Commander Bram Ostley began the following morning, though it revealed nothing for the first 2 days, beyond a man going about his ordinary duties, with no apparent awareness that his name had already surfaced in connection with theft and attempted murder. He drilled soldiers in the yard. He reviewed supply manifests. He dined in the officers' hall and complained, loudly and at length, about the quality of the winter rations, behavior so mundane that Dane began to wonder whether the attacker had lied about the authorization mark, or whether someone else entirely had used Ostley's seal without his knowledge. The break came on the 3rd night, when Ostley slipped out of the castle through a side gate usually reserved for deliveries, dressed in plain clothes rather than his uniform, and made his way through the darkened streets of the capital toward a tavern near the eastern docks, known for hosting business, better conducted away from watchful eyes. Dane followed at a careful distance, joined by 2 guardsmen he trusted to remain unseen, and watched through a grimy window as Ostley met with a cloaked figure in a corner booth, their conversation too quiet to overhear, but their body language unmistakably tense. The cloaked figure left first, moving quickly through the docks toward a waiting horse, and Dane made the decision on the spot to follow the stranger, rather than confront Ostley immediately, reasoning correctly that whoever this contact was mattered more than the commander himself. The pursuit led out of the capital entirely, along the eastern road, until the rider finally stopped at a modest manor house nearly 2 hours from the city walls, a property Dane did not recognize but promised to have identified before morning. He returned to the castle before dawn, and brought his findings directly to Cale, who had not slept, and to Sora, who had insisted on being present, despite Owen's gentle suggestion that she might prefer to rest after the events of the previous days. The manor belongs to a merchant family with trade connections to the southern territories, Dane reported, laying out a rough sketch of the property he had made from memory. Officially, they deal in textiles. Unofficially, I suspect we are about to discover they deal in a great deal more than fabric. Grain diverted from the refugee camps would need somewhere to go, Sora said, thinking aloud, the fear of the assassination attempt gradually giving way to the sharper, more familiar focus of a mind working through a puzzle. If it was never delivered to the camps, it had to be sold somewhere, quietly, to someone willing to pay well without asking questions about where it came from. A merchant family with existing trade routes to the south would be perfectly positioned to move it without drawing attention. Which means Ostley is not the architect of this scheme, Cale said slowly, the picture assembling itself in his mind, with the particular cold clarity that came over him whenever a threat to his kingdom crystallized into something he could actually fight. He is a tool. Someone with money and trade connections built this operation and used a corrupt commander's authority to keep it hidden from official scrutiny. Which means the question is no longer who stole the grain, Owen said grimly from his seat by the fire, where he had been listening without comment for most of the conversation. The question is who profits enough from a kingdom's refugees going hungry to risk a king's wrath finding out, and who was desperate enough to order a girl's throat cut over a ledger. The room went quiet at that, the weight of the question settling over all of them. Cale looked at Sora, at the thin, healing line at her throat where the blade had nicked her 3 nights earlier, and felt the same cold fury rise in him that had carried him across the archive floor to knock the knife away before it could do worse. Whoever stood behind this conspiracy had already shown a willingness to kill to protect it, and Cale understood, with the particular certainty of a man who had spent 5 years learning exactly how far he was willing to go to protect what mattered to him, that he would not rest until he had found them. "We move on the manor," he said finally, quietly and carefully, because whoever is behind this has already proven they will not hesitate to silence anyone who threatens the operation. Dane, I want a small, trusted party. Nothing that will draw attention from the road. Owen, I want every trade record connected to that merchant family pulled from the archive before nightfall. And me? Sora asked, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected the answer would not please her. You, Cale said, meeting her eyes with a gentleness that did nothing to soften his next words. "We'll remain here, under guard, where the people responsible for that assassin cannot reach you again." Sora's jaw tightened, the familiar stubbornness rising in her, but before she could argue, Kale added, quieter now, meant only for her. "I have already come too close to losing you once this week. I am not prepared to test how many more times I can arrive in time." Something in the raw honesty of that admission stopped her protest before it fully formed. She did not agree easily, and made her displeasure at being sidelined perfectly clear, but she did not argue further, recognizing in his voice a fear that had nothing to do with doubting her capability, and everything to do with a wound in him that had only just begun to heal, one he was clearly terrified of reopening. As the room emptied to prepare for the days ahead, Sora remained a moment longer, watching Kale gather the reports Owen had left for him, his movements sharp and purposeful, in a way she had not seen before, the careful, composed king giving way to something fiercer underneath. She understood, watching him, that whatever this investigation uncovered, it had already changed something fundamental in the space between them, pulling them closer together, through danger, in a way that months of careful archive visits never could have managed on their own. The manor sat quiet under a moonless sky when Kale's small party approached it 2 nights later. 5 riders moving carefully off the main road, their horses' hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. Dane led the way, having scouted the property thoroughly enough to know which gate stood unguarded and which windows offered the easiest entry, and Kale rode just behind him, dressed in plain traveling clothes rather than anything that marked him as a king, a decision Owen had argued against fiercely, and lost. "If something happens to you on this road," Owen had said, back in the castle, his voice tight with an old man's worry, "this kingdom loses its king over a raid you did not need to lead personally." "If I send soldiers to do what I am not willing to risk myself," Kale had answered, "then I am not the kind of king I have spent 5 years trying to become." Owen had not argued further after that, though his silence had carried its own kind of disapproval. The manor's interior proved easier to breach than Dane had expected, the merchant family apparently confident enough in their remote location to keep only a handful of guards posted, none of them prepared for a coordinated approach in the dead of night. Kale's party moved through the halls with practiced quiet, following the sound of voices to a study on the ground floor, where a lantern still burned despite the late hour. Inside, they found a heavy-set merchant Kale did not recognize, seated at a desk covered in ledgers that looked disturbingly similar to the ones Sora had spent weeks organizing back at the castle, and across from him, still in his commander's boots, though he had changed out of his uniform, sat Bram Ostley, his face going pale, and then furious, as the door burst open and armed men filed into the room. "Your Majesty," Ostley managed, half rising from his chair, before Dane's blade at his shoulder convinced him to sit back down. "Commander," Kale said, his voice deceptively calm, as he crossed the room and began leafing through the ledgers on the desk, confirming within moments that they matched precisely the pattern of discrepancies Sora had uncovered. "I trust you have a satisfying explanation for why grain meant to feed starving refugee children instead sits recorded in these pages as sold to private buyers." Ostley's explanation, delivered in a rushed, stumbling voice over the following hour of questioning, painted a picture uglier than even Owen had anticipated. The merchant, a man named Callum Vantry, had approached Ostley more than a year earlier with an offer too profitable to easily refuse, a scheme to divert a portion of the grain shipments meant for the refugee camps and sell the surplus quietly to buyers willing to pay well above market price during the famine, all while Ostley's forged authorizations kept the official records looking clean. Well, Ostley had taken the money out of simple greed, but it was the name Callum Vantry that made Kale go very still, the pieces of an old wound and a new conspiracy suddenly, impossibly, connecting. "Vantry," Kale repeated slowly, looking up from the ledgers to study the merchant more closely, noting for the first time a resemblance he had somehow missed, the same sharp jaw, the same calculating eyes he remembered from a coronation 5 years past. "Any relation to Leora Vantry?" The merchant's composure finally cracked. "My daughter," he admitted, his voice bitter, "though I doubt she would claim me these days, given how far our family's fortunes have fallen since she married into her husband's warlord territory, and abandoned the rest of us to manage on our own. The explanation that followed, dragged out of him over the remainder of the night, revealed a family desperate to rebuild wealth, and standing after years of decline, wealth that had once been secured by the promise of Leora's bond to the future king, a promise she had thrown away at the coronation, without ever considering what it would cost the rest of her family. Vantry had turned to smuggling and theft not from any grand political ambition, but from simple desperation, watching his family's status crumble, while his daughter built a new life for herself among foreign warlords, entirely indifferent to the consequences her rejection had left behind for everyone else who carried her name. It was not the grand conspiracy Owen had feared, no shadowy political enemy seeking to destabilize the throne, but the truth was somehow no less unsettling for its smaller scale, a reminder of how easily desperation could curdle into cruelty, how one impulsive act of rejection at a coronation had rippled outward for years, touching lives far beyond the two people standing at its center. Cale ordered both men bound and returned to the capital for formal trial, the grain accounts to be fully audited and restored, and the refugee camps to receive immediate compensation for the shortages they had suffered. It was well past dawn by the time the party rode back through the capital gates, exhausted but successful, and Cale went immediately to find Sora, rather than seeking the rest his body clearly needed. He found her in the archive, exactly where he expected, though the dark circles beneath her eyes suggested she had slept even less than he had over the preceding 2 nights. She rose the moment he entered, searching his face for injuries before he had even finished crossing the threshold, and something in her open, unguarded relief when she found none struck him more forcefully than the resolution of the entire investigation had. "You are unhurt," she said, and it was not quite a question. "I am unhurt," he confirmed, and then, because the exhaustion of the past days had worn away some of his usual careful restraint, he told her everything: the merchant, the forged authorizations, and finally, unavoidably, the name that connected the entire conspiracy back to the worst day of his life. Sora listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she did not offer the careful sympathy most people reached for when confronted with an old wound reopened by unexpected circumstance. Instead, she said, quietly but firmly, "She cost her own family everything, walking away from you that day, and it seems she never once looked back to see what she had broken behind her. That says a great deal about her character, and nothing at all about yours." Something in the simple certainty of the statement settled in Cale's chest in a way that 5 years of hard-won achievements never quite had. A small, steady confirmation that the story he had spent so long trying to rewrite through policy and discipline might, in fact, already be understood correctly by at least one person in his kingdom, without him having to prove anything further at all. The trial of Bram Ostley and Callum Vantry was held publicly, a decision Cale made deliberately, over the objections of several older advisors who preferred such matters handled quietly, away from the eyes of a court that thrived on gossip. He wanted the kingdom to see, clearly and without ambiguity, what happened to those who stole from people who had nothing left to lose. Ostley was stripped of his rank and sentenced to hard labor in the northern mines, while Vantry, whose crimes carried the additional weight of endangering a royal official, faced a longer sentence and the seizure of what remained of his family's estate. The court buzzed for weeks afterward with speculation about the connection to Leora Vantry, whispers that reached every corner of the capital and, inevitably, reached Sora as well, delivered secondhand through Ivy, who had a talent for gathering court gossip the way some wolves gathered firewood, methodically and without apparent effort. "They are saying," Ivy told her one afternoon in the laundry rooms, keeping her voice low despite the general noise of the space around them, "that the king has never so much as looked at another Omega since his rejection, not once in 5 years, and now here you are, appearing out of a refugee camp, and somehow tangled up in the very family that broke his heart in the first place. People find it very dramatic." "I did not ask to be tangled up in anything," Sora said, more sharply than she intended, though the sharpness was directed less at Ivy than at the uncomfortable truth of the observation. "I found discrepancies in a ledger. That is all this ever was." "And the fact that the king has visited your archive nearly every day for 2 months, that is also just ledgers?" Sora did not have a ready answer for that, and Ivy, sensing she had made her point, let the subject drop, though it lingered in Sora's mind for the rest of the day, following her back to her rooms that evening, sitting with her through a solitary dinner she barely tasted. She found Kale later that night in the castle gardens, a place she had not expected to find him, walking alone along a gravel path lined with winter roses that had somehow survived the harsh season through careful cultivation. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and something in his expression, tired and unguarded in the moonlight, told her he had been thinking about the same things she had. "I heard the court gossip," she said, without preamble, joining him on the path. "About Leora, about her family. About how strange it must seem that I ended up connected to all of it." Kale's jaw tightened slightly, an old, familiar tension she had come to recognize whenever the subject of his coronation arose, even indirectly. "You do not need to concern yourself with court gossip." "I am not concerned with the gossip," Sora said. "I am concerned that you still flinch every time her name comes up, 5 years later, and that you have never once told me what actually happened that day, only what everyone else has already whispered about it." He stopped walking. For a long moment he said nothing, the silence stretching between them long enough that Sora began to wonder if she had overstepped, if she had pushed at a wound he was not ready to have examined so directly. Then he spoke, quietly, the words coming slower than his usual measured confidence, as though he had to force each one out from somewhere he had kept carefully sealed for years. "She looked at me," he said, "in front of the entire kingdom, and told me I was not what she had been promised, that I was too small to be the alpha she had been raised to expect, and she was not wrong to think it, not entirely, because I have never been the kind of alpha who fills a room with his size alone. I have spent 5 years telling myself it does not matter, that I can be a good king without being a large one, and most days I nearly believe it. But there is still a part of me, Sora, that hears her voice every time I stand in a hall full of people, wondering if they are all thinking the same thing she said aloud." Sora listened to this without interrupting, and when he finished, she did not rush to comfort him with easy reassurance, understanding instinctively that easy reassurance was not what he needed, not after carrying this alone for 5 years. Instead, she stepped closer, until she stood directly in front of him, and looked up at him with the same steady, unflinching directness she had used against the soldier at the refugee camp, the same directness that had first caught his attention months earlier. "I have watched you fight off an assassin with your bare hands," she said. "I have watched you ride out personally to raid a smuggler's manor rather than send soldiers in your place. I have read every policy you have written in the past 5 years, because it is my job to understand the accounts they affect, and I have seen, in every single one of them, a king who thinks carefully about the people his decisions will touch. None of that has anything to do with the size of your shoulders, Kale. Leora Vantry looked at you and saw only what she had been raised to want. She never once looked hard enough to see what you actually are." Something in his face changed as she spoke, the careful composure cracking to reveal something rawer and more vulnerable underneath, an expression she suspected very few people in his life had ever been permitted to witness. "And what is it," he asked quietly, "that you see when you look at me?" Sora considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything, unwilling to offer him a comfortable answer, simply because it was easier than an honest one. "I see someone who worked himself half to exhaustion for 5 years, trying to prove a cruel woman wrong, when he never should have needed to prove anything to her at all. I see someone who still flinches at a memory he has no reason to still be ashamed of, and I see someone," she added, softer now, "who I have found myself thinking about far more than I intended to, when I first arrived at this castle expecting nothing more than a quiet post organizing ledgers." The silence that followed carried a different weight than the one before it, charged with something neither of them had spoken aloud until that moment, though both had clearly felt it building for weeks. Kale reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished, and brushed a strand of hair away from her face, his fingers lingering briefly against her cheek. "I told myself," he said quietly, "that I did not need a bond to hold a kingdom together, that I could rule with my mind alone, and it would be enough." "And has it been enough?" Sora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," he admitted, the honesty costing him something visible, a vulnerability he had guarded fiercely for 5 years, now laid bare in the quiet garden between them. "It has never once been enough." Neither of them moved to close the remaining distance that night, both too aware of everything that stood between them still unresolved, the ghosts of an old rejection, the danger of a conspiracy not yet fully unraveled, the uncertainty of what a second chance at a bond might mean for a king who had built his entire identity around not needing one. But something had shifted between them all the same, an acknowledgement neither could take back, and when Sora finally returned to her rooms that night, she found sleep came easier than it had in weeks, the ache of old caution beginning, slowly, to loosen its grip. The messenger arrived at dawn, exhausted and bleeding from a shallow wound across his forearm, carrying word that raiders had crossed the northern border under cover of night and struck one of the refugee camps still recovering from the winter's hardships, the very camp where Sora had first caught Kale's attention months earlier. The raiders, the messenger explained between ragged breaths, were not ordinary bandits but organized fighters, well-armed and disciplined, striking with a precision that suggested military training rather than opportunistic greed. Kale was on horseback within the hour, leading a company of soldiers north, at a pace that left even Dane, riding beside him, struggling to keep the group from exhausting their horses too early in the journey. Sora had wanted to come, had argued fiercely that her knowledge of the camp's layout and population could prove useful, but Kale had refused outright, unwilling after the assassination attempt to risk her safety anywhere near active combat. A refusal that led to their first real disagreement. Sharp words exchanged in the castle courtyard before he rode out, though neither of them meant the anger that colored those final moments before departure. The ride north took 2 full days, and by the time Kale's company arrived, the raiders had already struck twice more, retreating each time into the dense forest bordering the camp before Ashgrave patrols could organize a proper response. The camp itself had suffered losses, tents burned, supplies stolen, several refugees wounded defending what little they had left, and the fear in the camp was palpable. A population already worn thin by displacement, now facing an enemy that seemed to strike and vanish at will. Kale took command of the camp's defense personally, reorganizing the perimeter guard, coordinating with local trackers to anticipate the raiders' next likely target, and it was on the 3rd night of his presence, during an ambush he had personally helped plan to catch the raiders during their next strike, that everything went wrong. The trap worked, in the sense that it successfully drew the raiders into a position where Kale's soldiers could surround them, but the raiders fought with a desperate ferocity that suggested they had far more at stake than simple plunder, and in the chaos of the resulting battle, Kale found himself separated from the bulk of his company, facing 3 armed raiders alone in the darkness near the tree line. He fought well, years of disciplined training serving him better than his size ever could have alone, downing 1 attacker and wounding a second, before the 3rd managed to drive a blade deep into his side, just below his ribs, a wound that dropped him to his knees even as he managed, through sheer stubborn will, to disarm his attacker and force the man to flee, rather than finish what he had started. Dane found him minutes later, bleeding heavily into the frozen ground, and the ride back to the camp's makeshift medical tent felt, to Kale, like it happened at a great distance, his awareness fading in and out, as pain and blood loss dragged at the edges of his consciousness. Word reached the capital by fast rider the following morning, and Sora received the news in the archive, delivered by a shaking young messenger who had ridden through the night, rather than wait for a scheduled courier, understanding instinctively the urgency the message demanded. She did not remember the ride north afterward, only fragments of it, the burning ache in her legs from hours in the saddle, the terror that lodged itself in her chest and refused to loosen no matter how fast the horse beneath her moved. She arrived at the camp 2 days later, exhausted and half frantic, to find Kale alive but weakened, pale against the medical tent's rough blankets, a fever having set into the wound despite the field healer's best efforts to keep it clean. She dropped to her knees beside his cot, without hesitation, taking his hand in both of hers, and it was in that moment, skin against skin, fear and relief tangled together in her chest, that something ancient and unbidden stirred to life between them. The bond did not arrive gently. It arrived the way it always did, sudden and undeniable, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the tent's small fire, a recognition that settled into her bones, before her mind had fully caught up to understand what was happening. Kale's eyes opened at the same instant, fever-bright, but suddenly, sharply aware, and she watched him feel it too, watched the shock of it move across his face, even through his exhaustion and pain. "Sora," he said, her name carrying a weight it had not held before, and she understood. with a clarity that struck her like cold water, exactly what had just happened between them. "You are hurt," she said, instead of responding to the obvious truth hanging in the air, focusing on the practical, because the alternative felt too enormous to address while he lay bleeding in front of her. "Do not try to speak. Save your strength." But even as she busied herself checking his bandages, calling for the healer, doing everything her practical mind could think to occupy itself with, she felt the bond humming quietly beneath her skin, steady and warm, entirely different from the way she had imagined it might feel, in the rare moments she had allowed herself to imagine it at all. It did not feel like a burden or an obligation. It felt, strangely, like coming home to a place she had not known she was searching for. Cale's fever broke 2 days later, the wound finally responding to treatment, and as his strength slowly returned, so too did the full weight of what had happened between them settle over both of them, neither entirely certain, in the aftermath of danger and relief, what they were now supposed to do with a bond that fate had apparently decided to offer a second time, to two people who had both, in their own separate ways, sworn off ever trusting it again. The journey back to the capital was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace. Cale healed steadily during the ride south, his strength returning day by day, but the closer they drew to the castle, the more Sora noticed him withdrawing, retreating behind the same careful, composed mask he had worn for 5 years, before she ever arrived at his court. He spoke to her politely, asked after her comfort during the journey, thanked her for staying by his side during his recovery, but the warmth that had passed between them in the medical tent seemed to have folded itself away somewhere he was not willing to let her reach. By the time they reached the capital, he had stopped meeting her eyes for longer than a passing moment, and the daily visits to the archive, once so frequent they had become the subject of court gossip, simply stopped altogether. Days passed, then a week. Sora told herself he needed time to recover fully from his injury, that a king returning from a near-fatal wound had a great many pressing matters demanding his attention, and she busied herself with the ordinary rhythms of her work, though the ache of his sudden absence sat heavier in her chest than she wanted to admit. It was Owen who finally told her the truth, finding her in the archive one evening with the particular weary patience of a man who had watched this exact pattern play out once before, and had no intention of watching it destroy something good a second time. "He is afraid," Owen said, without preamble, settling into the chair across from her work table uninvited, "not of raiders or corrupt commanders, of you, or rather, of what it would mean to let himself hope again, after the last time hope cost him everything in front of the entire kingdom." "He has the bond," Sora said, frustration bleeding into her voice despite her effort to keep it steady. It came back. "Fate does not offer that twice by accident. What more does he need to trust it?" "Fate has never been the problem," Owen said gently. "The boy trusted fate completely, 5 years ago, and fate handed him a bond that broke in front of everyone he was meant to rule. He does not fear that the bond is false, Sora. He fears that it is real, and that trusting it again means risking the same humiliation twice, and I do not think his pride has fully healed enough to survive that risk without a fight." Sora sat with this for a long moment, turning it over the way she turned over every difficult problem, searching for the piece that would let her actually address it, rather than simply understand it. "Then I suppose," she said finally, "someone will have to remind him that I am not Leora Vantry, and that I have never once asked him to be anything other than exactly what he already is." She found him that night in the same garden where he had first admitted, months earlier, that ruling with his mind alone had never been enough. He was seated on a stone bench beneath the winter roses, alone, and he startled slightly when she appeared on the path, the composure he had worn so carefully for the past week, faltering for just a moment before he caught it again. "Sora," he said, rising. "I did not expect—" "You have been avoiding me," she said, cutting through whatever polite explanation he had been preparing, because she had learned, in her months at the capital, that gentle circling never got either of them anywhere useful. "For a week now. Ever since the bond came back, you have found 100 reasons to be anywhere I am not, and I would like you to stop pretending you have not noticed doing it." Cale's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might retreat into denial, might offer some careful diplomatic excuse the way he had offered careful diplomatic excuses to the entire court for the past 5 years. Instead, something in him seemed to give way, the exhaustion of maintaining the mask finally outweighing his instinct to keep it in place. "I do not know how to do this again," he admitted quietly, I spent 5 years convincing myself, and the entire kingdom, that I did not need a bond, that I was strong enough to rule without one. And now fate has handed me a second chance, with someone I care for more than I have ever cared for anyone, and all I can think about is standing in front of my court again, reaching for you the way I reached for her, and watching your face change the way hers did. Kale. Sora crossed the remaining distance between them and took his hands in hers, the same way she had taken his hand in the medical tent when the bond first sparked to life, though this time neither of them was distracted by blood or fever, only by the raw honesty of the moment stretched between them. I have watched you fight assassins and raiders and corrupt commanders without hesitation, without letting fear stop you for even a moment, and here you are, letting fear win against the one thing that could actually make you happy, simply because it once cost you something painful in the past. It is not the same kind of fear, he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. It is exactly the same kind of fear, Sora said firmly. It is only harder to fight because it lives inside your own chest, instead of standing in front of you with a blade. But I am not asking you to trust fate blindly, Kale. Fate already made its choice twice, and both times it chose correctly, because the problem was never the bond itself. The problem was that the first person fate chose was never willing to see you clearly enough to deserve it. I am asking you to trust me, not fate. Me, the woman who has spent months watching you work yourself to exhaustion for people who will never know how hard you fought for them, who stood beside your bed through a fever because there was nowhere else I wanted to be, who does not care, and has never once cared, how tall you stand in a crowded hall. Kale looked at her for a long moment, something fragile and hopeful breaking slowly across his face, the careful composure of 5 years finally, completely dissolving. You truly do not care, he said, not quite a question, about any of it. The height, the size, the whole foolish measure the rest of the world seems determined to judge me by. I care, Sora said, that you fought off an armed man with your bare hands to protect me. I care that you rode north the moment your people needed you, and nearly died doing it. I care that you have never once, in all these months, made me feel small for my limp, or my sharp tongue, or my complete lack of noble blood. None of that has anything to do with your height, Kale. It never did. He pulled her closer then, slowly, giving her every chance to step away if she wished, and when she did not, when she leaned into him instead, resting her forehead against his chest, he wrapped his arms around her carefully, mindful still of his healing wound, and held her the way he had wanted to hold her since the moment he first watched her stand her ground against a soldier, twice her size at a refugee camp in the freezing cold. I am done being afraid, he said quietly, into her hair. I have spent 5 years proving to a kingdom that I did not need this. I would rather spend the rest of my life proving to you that I do. Sora laughed softly against his chest, the sound carrying more relief than humor. And for the first time since the bond had reawakened in that fever-warm medical tent, neither of them felt the need to pull away from what fate, and their own stubborn hearts, had finally allowed them to find. The announcement arrived 3 weeks later, carried by a formal envoy in the colors of a warlord territory far to the east, requesting an audience for Lady Leora, wife of warlord Kestrel Dray, on a matter of trade and border alliance. Kale read the request twice before setting it down, a strange, distant calm settling over him that surprised him more than any sharper reaction might have. You do not have to grant her an audience, Owen said, watching his face carefully for any sign of the old wound reopening. You are within your rights to refuse any envoy whose family stands convicted of crimes against your throne. Her father's crimes are not hers, Kale said, though the words carried less warmth than simple fact. And refusing a legitimate trade alliance out of old grievance would be poor governance, whatever I might privately feel about the woman requesting it. He glanced up, and something steadier than Owen expected looked back at him. I will grant the audience. I find I am no longer as afraid of that particular ghost as I once was. Sora, when he told her that evening, studied him carefully for any trace of old pain hiding beneath his composed surface, and found, to her quiet relief, that his calm seemed genuine rather than performed. You are certain, she said, not quite a question. I am certain, Kale said, taking her hand, though I would consider it a personal favor if you stood beside me during the audience, rather than in the archive pretending not to be curious about how it goes. Sora laughed despite herself, and agreed. Leora arrived at court a week later, and the years had changed her. Cale noticed immediately, in ways that seemed to have little to do with age. The careful, confident poise she had carried at his coronation had hardened into something brittler, a woman who had traded the promise of a kingdom for a warlord's territory, and seemed, beneath her formal courtesies, to be quietly measuring whether the trade had been worth it. She bowed to him with correct formality, offered the expected pleasantries about his health and his kingdom's prosperity, and it was only when her gaze moved to Sora, standing beside the throne with the unmistakable bearing of someone who belonged there, that her composure flickered. "You have found a new mate," Leora said, her tone carefully neutral, though something sharper moved beneath it. "I have," Cale said simply, offering no further explanation, feeling no need to justify his happiness to a woman who had once discarded it so publicly. The trade negotiations proceeded with professional efficiency over the following days, both sides working through terms with the careful precision such agreements demanded, and Cale found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he could sit across from Leora in council sessions without the old ache stirring at all, the wound that had once felt permanent, now simply a scar, present but no longer painful. It was Leora herself who sought Sora out privately, on the final evening before the envoy's departure, finding her in the garden that had become, over the preceding months, something of a sanctuary for both Sora and Cale. She approached carefully, and Sora, recognizing the hesitance in her posture, did not turn away. "I owe you no explanation," Leora said, without preamble, "but I find myself wanting to give one regardless. I was young and foolish and raised by a family that valued the wrong things far too highly. I looked at Cale that day and saw only what I had been taught to want, never what he actually was. I have had 5 years, and a marriage that taught me a great deal about what true strength actually looks like, to understand exactly how much I threw away that day, and it was never really him I lost. It was the chance to know someone who might have actually loved me for reasons that had nothing to do with a crown." Sora listened to this without offering easy forgiveness, because it was not hers to offer on Cale's behalf, but she found, unexpectedly, that she felt no bitterness toward the woman standing in front of her, only a distant kind of understanding for a mistake that had cost Cale 5 painful years, and had, in its own strange way, eventually led Sora directly to his door. "He has healed," Sora said simply. "Whatever this cost him, he has built something good from what was left. I would not change the path that brought us here, even knowing how much pain preceded it." Leora nodded slowly, something like genuine peace settling over her features for the first time since her arrival. "Then I am glad," she said, "that fate gave him a second chance, and gave it to someone who actually deserves to hold it." She left the garden without waiting for a response, and Sora watched her go, understanding that whatever closure this conversation had offered, it belonged to Leora as much as to Cale, a chapter finally, quietly closed on both sides. The trade envoy departed the following morning, the alliance secured on fair terms that benefited both territories, and Cale watched the procession ride out through the capital gates with a lightness in his chest that surprised him, the last lingering shadow of his coronation finally, fully released. "You are smiling," Sora observed, standing beside him at the gate. "I find," Cale said, taking her hand, "that I no longer have any reason not to." Cale called for a formal court gathering the following month, ostensibly to review the final resolution of the grain conspiracy and the terms of the new Eastern Trade Alliance. But Owen, reading the careful preparations underway in the royal wing, suspected the true purpose long before Cale admitted it aloud. "You intend to claim the bond publicly," Owen said, watching Cale review a speech he had rewritten at least 4 times over the preceding week. "I intend to stop letting this kingdom's old assumptions dictate how I live my life," Cale said. 5 years ago, I stood in that hall and let a public rejection define me for far longer than it should have. I would like the same hall to witness something different this time. Not everyone in the court welcomed the announcement warmly. A faction of older nobles, families who had long hoped to see the throne bonded to someone of established noble lineage, murmured their disapproval in private corridors, questioning whether an archive clerk with no family name and a limp from an old injury truly belonged beside a king, whatever fate's bond might suggest. Lord Fenwick Aldrich, the most vocal among them, requested a private audience with Cale the week before the ceremony, arriving with the careful, condescending diplomacy of a man who believed himself to be offering helpful counsel rather than obstruction. "Your Majesty," Fenwick began, "I understand the appeal of the bond, truly I do, but a king's mate carries political weight beyond simple affection. The court will ask questions about her lineage, her suitability, her ability to represent this kingdom among foreign dignitaries who value such things highly." Cale listened to the entire speech without interrupting, then answered with a calm that carried more authority than raised anger ever could have. "Lord Fenwick, this same court once watched a woman of impeccable noble lineage reject me publicly at my own coronation, because she judged my worth by the width of my shoulders. I have spent 5 years since then learning that lineage and worth are not the same measure at all. Sora Linden uncovered a conspiracy that was stealing grain from starving children, and very nearly paid for that discovery with her life, without once asking for recognition or reward. She has more integrity in her smallest finger than most of the noble houses represented in this court combined. I would remind you, gently, that questioning her suitability in my presence is not counsel I intend to welcome twice." Fenwick left the audience considerably paler than he had arrived, and word of the exchange spread through the court within hours, most of the murmuring dying down considerably once it became clear exactly how firmly the king intended to stand behind his choice. The day of the ceremony arrived bright and cold, the great hall filled once more with nobles, warriors, and elders, the same space where 5 years earlier Cale had stood humiliated in front of the entire kingdom. This time, Sora stood beside him at the base of the steps rather than waiting to be approached, her chin lifted, her posture steady, entirely unlike the frightened retreat the hall had witnessed once before. Cale took her hand in front of the assembled court, and this time there was no hesitation, no flinch, no uncertain silence waiting to be filled with rejection. "5 years ago," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall, "I stood in this room and was told I was not what a king was meant to be. I believed, for longer than I should have, that the measure of my worth lay in my size, my strength, the shape of the alpha I was expected to become. I have since learned that worth is measured in far different terms, in the courage to stand your ground against those who would harm the powerless, in the honesty to speak truth, even when it costs you comfort, in the loyalty that asks for nothing in return but chooses to stay anyway." He turned to Sora, and the hall watched, in complete silence, as he lifted her wrist gently, and pressed his lips to the mark already formed there, sealed weeks earlier, in a quiet fever tent, far from any court's watching eyes, though the formal acknowledgement had waited until this moment, chosen deliberately. "I claim this bond," he said, loud enough for every corner of the hall to hear, "not because fate demands it, but because I choose it, fully and without condition, and I would choose it again in every version of this life I might have lived." The hall that had once gone silent with cruel judgment now erupted into something entirely different, a swell of approval that started among the younger soldiers who had trained beside their king, and spread quickly through the rest of the gathering, until even the most reluctant of the old noble families found themselves swept into the general celebration, rather than standing apart from it. Sora, overwhelmed by the sound and the weight of the moment, felt tears she had not expected slip free, and Cale reached up to brush them away, with a gentleness that belonged entirely to the private garden they had claimed as their own, brought now into the full light of the public hall. "You do not have to cry," he murmured, "only for her." "I am not sad," Sora said, laughing through the tears. "I simply never imagined a room this large could hold this much happiness, after everything that happened in it before." "Rooms remember what we teach them to remember," Cale said softly. "I intend to teach this one a much better story than the one it has been telling for the past 5 years." The celebration that followed lasted long into the night, the great hall filled with music and warmth, in a way it had not been since before Cale's father's death, and if any lingering ghosts of that first painful coronation still haunted its corners, they seemed, by the end of the evening, to have finally, fully been laid to rest. A year passed, and then another, and the kingdom that had once whispered about its undersized king now told a different story entirely, one that mothers repeated to their daughters and fathers repeated to their sons, about a king who had been broken publicly and had chosen, rather than hardening into bitterness, to rebuild himself into someone worth loving, and about the sharp-tongued clerk who had seen his true worth when the rest of the world could only see his size. Sora continued her work in the archives long after the bonding ceremony, refusing every suggestion from the court that a queen ought to set aside such practical labor for more ceremonial duties. She expanded the system she had built for the refugee accounts into a kingdom-wide reform of how Ashgrave tracked and distributed resources during times of hardship, ensuring that the conditions which had once allowed a desperate merchant to steal from starving children could never again slip through unnoticed. Nolan, the anxious archivist who had first handed her that overwhelming stack of ledgers, became her most trusted deputy, and together they built an administration so thorough that neighboring kingdoms began sending envoys simply to study how Ashgrave managed its resources so efficiently. Cale, for his part, continued to rule with the same relentless attention to detail that had carried him through 5 lonely years, but the weight of his work no longer felt like armor built to hide a wound. He trained in the yard alongside his soldiers still, not to prove anything to a watching court, but because he genuinely enjoyed the discipline of it, and because Sora liked to watch from the shade of the covered walkway, offering commentary sharp enough to make even Dane Wren laugh mid-drill. Owen lived to see their first child born, a daughter with her mother's steady, unflinching gaze and her father's careful, thoughtful patience, and the old wolf declared, holding her for the first time, that he had never in 3 generations of Ashgrave kings seen a child arrive into a household so thoroughly, unreservedly happy. He did not live to see her grow much older, passing peacefully in his sleep the following winter. But Cale kept his old advisor's chair by the study fire exactly where it had always sat, and told his daughter stories about the gruff, gray-muzzled wolf who had raised her father through his hardest years, so that she would grow up knowing exactly whose steady hand had helped shape the kingdom she would one day inherit. Leora Vantry sent occasional correspondence from the Eastern Territories over the following years, brief but genuine notes marking the birth of Cale and Sora's children, the anniversaries of the trade alliance, small gestures of goodwill from a woman who had finally, fully made peace with the past she once tried to outrun. Cale answered each letter politely, without warmth but without bitterness either, a closed chapter acknowledged rather than reopened, and found that he could read her name now without feeling anything at all beyond the mild, distant recognition one might extend to any old acquaintance. The great hall where Cale had once stood, rejected in front of his entire court, became, in time, the site of countless celebrations that slowly buried the memory of that single painful day beneath years of happier occasions, weddings and festivals, and the joyful noise of children who had never known their king as anything other than steady, capable, and deeply loved by the woman who stood beside him. When visitors to the capital asked about the old rumors they had heard, stories about a king once rejected for his size, the court had long since stopped repeating them as cautionary gossip, and started telling them instead, as the opening chapter of a much better story, one where a wound that should have broken a man, instead, became the very thing that taught him what real strength looked like. Cale Ashgrave never grew any taller than he had been on the day of his coronation, never filled a room the way his father once had simply by walking into it. He did not need to. He had learned, through 5 hard years and one small, unflinching woman who refused to measure him by anyone else's broken expectations, that a kingdom did not need a king built like a giant. It needed a king who showed up, again and again, for the people who needed him most, who chose courage over comfort, who understood that true partnership was never about matching someone in size, but about matching them in heart. And in Sora, steady and fierce and utterly unimpressed by crowns or titles, he had found exactly that. A partner who had never once needed him to be anything other than precisely, completely himself. The kingdom of Ashgrave prospered for many years under their joint rule, remembered not for the size of its king, but for the strength of the bond that guided him, a bond that had been broken once by cruelty and rebuilt, stronger than ever, by 2 people who understood that fate only ever offers the beginning of a story. It is what 2 hearts choose to build from that beginning that decides how the story truly ends.